The sun had not yet cleared the eastern peaks of the San Jacinto Mountains, but the heat was already building. By 6 in the morning, the temperature in Riverside Town Square had climbed to 95 degrees, and the wooden platform at the center of the plaza radiated warmth like a cook stove. William Garrett stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his calloused hand gripping the brim of his father's old hat. The felt was worn thin in places, stained with years of honest sweat and mountain dust. It was the only thing left from the family ranch, the one Whitmore had taken 5 years ago, with a forged debt and a corrupt surveyor's map. Will had come to town for rope, just rope, 300 feet of good hemp line to repair the north fence before the autumn cattle drive. But the commotion in the square had pulled him from the general store, and now he could not look away. On the auction block, a woman stood with her spine straight as a fence post. Her hair had gone silver, pulled back in a simple knot that revealed a face weathered by sun and hardship. Her feet were bare against the scorched planks, but she did not dance or flinch. She simply stood there, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, beyond the indignity of this moment. The auctioneer was a fat man named Harlan, known throughout the county for selling everything from cattle to mining claims. He brought his wooden gavel down with a crack that echoed off the storefronts. Lot number 7. Harlan announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had sold 1,000 things he did not own. Margaret Fletcher, 55 years of age, still strong enough for laundry and cooking, good with the needle, quiet disposition. A woman in the crowd laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Who would waste food on something that old? She is not worth a bent nickel. More laughter rippled through the gathering. Will felt his jaw tighten. He scanned the faces around him, farmers looking for cheap labor, merchants hoping to find a cook they would not have to pay fair wages, opportunists drawn like flies to the scent of desperation. His eyes found a young man standing well back from the platform, shoulders hunched, face turned half away. Thomas Fletcher. Will recognized him from church. He had seen the resemblance in the set of the jaw, the color of the eyes. This was family, and family had brought her here. Will looked at the auctioneer's table. There were no contract papers laid out, no lawyer standing by to witness terms of employment, no mention of duration or wages or conditions. This was not a legal contract labor arrangement, the kind that had become common since the war between the states. This was something else entirely. This was a sale. California law had forbidden the buying and selling of human beings since 1850. Will had read the statutes himself late at night in the small ranch house, when the emptiness of the rooms pressed too close and he needed something to fill his mind besides memories of Catherine's laugh and Daniel's small hand in his. The law was clear. A person could enter into voluntary labor contracts, but they could not be sold. Not for any price. Not by anyone. And yet here stood Margaret Fletcher on an auction block, while her nephew hid his face in shame, and the good citizens of Riverside prepared to bid on her like she was a milk cow or a wagon wheel. Will's hand moved to his coat pocket, where his leather wallet rested against his chest. Inside were 6 $20 gold pieces. $120. 3 months of wages from his time as a railroad engineer, saved dollar by painful dollar. Money he had earmarked for a new windmill pump to expand irrigation on the ranch. Water meant growth. Growth meant profit. Profit meant he could finally stop living one drought away from losing everything. But standing here, watching this woman hold her dignity in the face of public humiliation, Will found he could not think about windmills or profit margins or carefully laid plans. He could only think about his father standing in front of Whitmore's bank 5 years ago, trying to explain that the debt was wrong, that the numbers had been changed, that justice mattered. And he could think about himself at 26, watching from across the street, knowing the law was being broken, but doing nothing because he was young and scared, and certain that one person could not stand against men with money and power. His father had died 6 months later. The doctor said it was his heart. But Will knew better. A man's heart could break from losing his land just as surely as from any disease. The auctioneer raised his gavel again. We will start the bidding at $20. Do I hear 20? Oh, Will stepped forward. His boots struck the hard-packed earth with deliberate weight. The crowd parted as he walked through and conversations died mid-sentence. She is not merchandise, Will said. His voice came out level and hard, carrying across the square without him having to shout. Harlan lowered his gavel, confusion crossing his doughy face. Who are you, William Garrett? He moved closer to the platform, close enough that everyone present would have to acknowledge what came next. And I know California law. We have prohibited the buying and selling of people since 1850. This woman has not signed any contract labor agreement. There is no lawyer here representing her interests. You are not conducting a legal employment arrangement. You are conducting a slave auction. The word fell like a stone into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the crowd. Even in 1885, 35 years after statehood, 20 years since the war's end, that word still had power. Harlan's face flushed red. Now see here, the family came to me. They said she needed placement. This is all perfectly legal. Then show me the contract. Will extended his hand. Show me her signature. Show me the terms of employment. Show me the lawyer who witnessed her consent. Silence. Harlan shuffled through the papers on his table, but Will already knew what he would find. Nothing. Or worse than nothing, some scrap of paper signed only by Thomas Fletcher, attempting to contract away another person's freedom, as if he owned it. Will turned to look at Thomas, who had gone pale as milk. Is this your aunt? Thomas managed a nod. What debt does she owe your family? The young man's voice came out barely above a whisper. 1 bag of flour, so we would not starve this winter. The admission hung in the air. 1 bag of flour. The price of a human being's freedom calculated in pounds of ground wheat. Will reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. His fingers found a $5 gold piece, small and heavy, and worth more than any sack of grain. He flipped it through the air. Thomas caught it by reflex. There, Will said. Enough to buy 5 bags of flour. The debt is paid. He turned back to Harlan, pulled out the rest of his money, and walked to the auctioneer's table. The leather pouch landed with a solid thump that scattered dust across the worn wood surface. Coins spilled out, glinting in the early morning sun. $120, Will announced. 6 times your opening bid. But I am not buying her. I am paying whatever debt you think exists between this woman and her family. After that, she is free. Free to stay, free to go. Her choice not mine and certainly not yours. He looked up at Margaret Fletcher. She was staring at him now, those steady eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent, as if she could see straight through to the grief and guilt and loneliness he carried like stones in his chest. Mrs. Fletcher, he said, his voice gentler now, I own a ranch 15 miles south of here. I need help. The work is hard, but I pay fair wages. $18 a month plus room and board. You would have your own quarters with a lock on the inside of the door. A written contract that spells out every term. And if you ever want to leave, I will take you anywhere you want to go and give you enough money to start fresh. He paused, letting her absorb the offer. But this is your choice. Not your nephew's, not mine. Yours. If you want to walk away from here right now, I will give you $20 and wish you well. If you want to come work for me, you come as an employee, not as property. Either way, you are a free woman. What do you say? Margaret Fletcher's lips parted. For the first time since Will had approached the platform, emotion flickered across her face, not relief exactly. Something deeper, something that looked like the first breath after nearly drowning. Why? Her voice was rough from disuse but clear. Why would you do this for me? The question struck Will harder than he expected. Why, Debane? Because he had failed his father. Because he knew what it felt like to watch injustice and do nothing. Because he had lost everyone he loved, and the emptiness had taught him that some things mattered more than money or safety or careful plans. But he could not say all of that to a stranger on an auction block. So he said simply, because it is right. Margaret Fletcher looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at her nephew, at the crowd, at the auctioneer's flustered face. When her gaze returned to Will, something had settled in her expression. I choose to go with you, Mr. Garrett. She walked to the edge of the platform. Will offered his hand. Her palm was rough with calluses, her grip firm. She stepped down, and for the first time in what might have been years, her feet touched ground that belonged to no one but herself. Sheriff Henry Cook emerged from the crowd, then a tall man in his late 40s with iron gray hair and a star pinned to his vest. Garrett is right, he said to Harlan. This is not a legal proceeding. Best to end it now before someone files a complaint with the county. Harlan knew when he was beaten. He waved his hand dismissively. Fine. Lot 7 is withdrawn. Next item is, but Will was already walking away, Margaret Fletcher at his side, leaving the murmur of shocked conversation behind them. They had made it halfway across the square when a voice called out, "Mr. Garrett!" Will turned. A man sat astride a fine black horse at the edge of the plaza. He was perhaps 52 years old, dressed in an expensive wool vest despite the heat, his silver hair combed back from a face that spoke of wealth and certainty. Charles Whitmore. "I heard you were working the Riverside Valley Ranch again," Whitmore said, guiding his horse closer. "Making improvements, putting in crops." "I am. That is good land, close to my property. I have been thinking about expansion." Whitmore's eyes flicked to Margaret Fletcher, then back to Will. "I would be willing to make an offer, a generous one. Name your price." "The ranch is not for sale." Whitmore smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Everything is for sale eventually, Mr. Garrett. It is just a matter of finding the right number." "Then you will be looking for a very long time." "Perhaps." Whitmore stroked his horse's neck, the gesture casual. "Though I notice you just spent a considerable sum on help." He emphasized the last word delicately. $120 is a significant expense. Added to your annual land taxes of $200, plus whatever you owe on seed and equipment, I wonder if you have thought through the mathematics of your situation. Will met the older man's gaze without flinching. "My finances are my own business." Of course, of course." Whitmore gathered his reins. "But drought is coming, Mr. Garrett. I can smell it in the air. When it arrives, we will see who can afford principles and who cannot. We will talk again." He touched his hat brim in mock courtesy and rode away, his horse's hooves striking sharp echoes from the hard earth. Margaret Fletcher waited until Whitmore was out of earshot before speaking. "Who was that, Trouble?" Will said quietly. "Come on, my wagon is this way." The journey from Riverside to Garrett Ranch covered 15 miles of rough road that wound through scrubland and oak groves. Will's wagon was not new, but he kept it in good repair. The wheels greased and the axles straight. His two draft horses, both bays with white blazes, pulled steadily despite the climbing heat. For the first hour, they rode in silence. Margaret Fletcher sat on the bench beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes taking in the landscape with the attention of someone who had learned to notice everything. Will found himself acutely aware of her presence, of the questions that must be forming in her mind, of the strangeness of the situation they had both entered into. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Whitmore seemed to know a great deal about your financial situation. He makes it his business to know everyone's situation. The man owns half the county and wants the other half." Will kept his eyes on the road ahead, where heat shimmers made the air dance above the packed dirt. "Including my ranch." "But you said it was not for sale." "It is not, and it will not be." The words came out harder than he intended. He took a breath, forced his shoulders to relax. "I apologize. It is a difficult subject." "I understand difficult subjects." Will glanced at her. She was looking at him now, and something in her expression made him want to explain. Not because he owed her an explanation, but because he suddenly wanted her to understand. "The ranch I own now is 240 acres, he began. "I bought it in 1884 with money I saved working as a railroad engineer. But before that, my father owned a different ranch. 160 acres along the river, good land with easy water access. He bought it in 1865 after he mustered out of the Union Army. What happened to it? In '80, we had a bad year. Crops failed, cattle prices dropped. My father needed money for seed and supplies to make it through to the next season, so he went to Whitmore's bank and borrowed $300. Will's hands tightened on the reins. Even now, 5 years later, the anger came back fresh. Whitmore altered the loan documents, changed the amount to $800 using complex language my father did not fully understand. When the payment came due, my father could not pay what Whitmore claimed he owed. The bank foreclosed, took the whole ranch. Could you not contest it in court? The Homestead Protection Act only covers farms under 40 acres. My father's ranch was too large to qualify for protection, and Whitmore had lawyers who could make fraud look legal on paper. Will shook his head. I was 26 years old and working for the railroad in San Francisco. By the time I got home, it was done. 6 months later, my father died. The doctor said it was his heart, but I know losing that land killed him as surely as any bullet. Margaret Fletcher was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. The Homestead Protection Act you mentioned. That was the California law from 1879, correct? Will looked at her in surprise. You know about it. My late husband, John Fletcher, was a blacksmith, but he was also active in the farmers' rights movement. We used to read law books together in the evenings. He believed that the law was the only weapon poor people had if they knew how to use it. Your husband sounds like he was a good man. He was. He died 10 years ago in a workshop accident. After that, I raised my nephew Thomas. His parents, my brother and sister-in-law, had both passed from cholera. I thought I was doing the right thing giving the boy a home, teaching him to work hard and be honest. Her voice carried a note of bitterness. I did not realize I was raising someone who would sell me for flour. He is young and weak, but weakness is not the same as evil. Perhaps not, but it can do just as much damage. They rode on. The landscape changed as they left the flatter ground near Riverside and began climbing into the foothills. Oak trees clustered in the low places where underground water fed their roots. The air smelled of dust and dry grass and the faint resin scent of juniper. Will found himself explaining more than he had intended, about working for Southern Pacific Railroad from 1881 to 1884, about the $80 a month that had seemed like a fortune compared to farming, about saving $2,400 in 3 years through brutal economy living in boarding houses and eating one meal a day, sending nothing home because there was no home left to send it to. I knew I wanted land again, he said, but good land near water was expensive. Then I heard about this parcel, 240 acres that nobody wanted because it was dry and rocky and far from town. But I had done survey work for the railroad. I knew how to read topography. And I knew there was an aquifer under this land at about 60 feet depth. So you bought it and dug a well? Exactly. Took me 8 months. I did it myself, working from first light to last. The well is 65 feet deep, lined with oak casing 4 feet in diameter. When I finally hit water, it was like striking gold. 15 gallons per minute, enough for 50 head of cattle and 2 acres of crops. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the crest of a hill. Below them, the Garrett Ranch spread across a small valley backed by the purple bulk of the San Jacinto Mountains. The main house was small, just 2 bedrooms, and a combined living area and kitchen built from pine logs chinked with clay. The barn stood 40 feet by 60, its loft door hanging slightly crooked. Fences zigzagged across the property, some sections straight and new, others sagging with age. A windmill stood near the barn, its blades turning slowly in the morning breeze. It was not much to look at. Will knew that. Compared to Whitmore's mansion or the big Spanish land-grant ranches to the south, it was practically nothing. But it was his, built with his own hands and his own money, and no one could take it away. Welcome to Garrett Ranch, he said quietly. Margaret Fletcher studied the property with the same careful attention she had given the passing landscape. Will found himself tensing, waiting for disappointment or judgment. Instead, she nodded slowly. Good bones, she said. The barn needs work. The north fence is failing. But the well placement is excellent and the house is positioned to catch the prevailing breeze. This is solid. Something in Will's chest loosened. You see all that? I have been working on farms and ranches my entire life, Mr. Garrett. I know what good structure looks like, and I know the difference between neglect and poverty. This is not poverty. This is a man working alone, doing the best he can. She was right, of course. After Catherine and Daniel died 3 years ago, Will had let everything slide except the absolute essentials. He had kept the cattle alive. He had maintained the well. He had paid his taxes. But the garden had gone to weeds. The barn needed repairs he kept putting off. The house had become just a place to sleep between dawn and dusk of endless work. He had been surviving, not living. Come on, he said, releasing the brake. Let me show you the rest. They spent the next hour touring the property. Will showed her the well, explaining the pulley system he had rigged for hauling up water. He walked her through the barn, pointing out where the loft floor was rotting and needed replacement boards. He took her to the north pasture where 200 feet of fence sagged dangerously, held up more by habit than actual structural integrity. Margaret Fletcher asked questions that revealed deep knowledge. What was the water table depth? How many cattle could the land sustainably support? When was the last time he had tested the soil for alkali? What breed of cattle did he raise and why? By the time they returned to the main house, Will had a strange feeling he could not quite name. It was not attraction exactly, though he noticed how capable her hands looked, how straight she held her spine. It was more like recognition. Here was someone who understood the language he spoke, who saw the world through similar eyes. Inside the house, he led her to a small room off the main living area. It had been his father's workshop once before the foreclosure. Now it held a simple bed frame, a chest of drawers, and a chair. A window looked out toward the vegetable garden. "This would be your room," Will said. "It has a lock on the inside of the door. I want you to feel safe here." Margaret Fletcher walked to the window, looked out at the neglected garden plot. "A room of my own," she said softly. "I have not had that in 10 years. Will felt something twist in his chest. "You deserve privacy. You deserve respect. And I intend to give you both." She turned to face him. "Why are you doing this truly? You could have hired anyone, someone younger, someone who would work for less." "I could have," Will agreed, "Bondi, but I did not want anyone. I wanted someone strong enough to do the work that needs doing. Someone smart enough to be a partner, not just a laborer. Someone who has survived enough to understand what this place means." He met her eyes. "I think you are that person." Before she could respond, he went to the kitchen table and pulled out a sheet of clean paper and a pencil. "I want to write out a contract right now before anything else happens. I want both of us to be clear about what we are agreeing to." He wrote carefully, forming each word with deliberate precision. When he finished, he pushed the paper across the table to her. Employment contract, date July 15, 1885, between William Garrett, owner, and Margaret Fletcher. Employee terms: wages, $18 per month paid on the first day of each month, housing private room with lock clean linens, adequate heating, meals, 3 meals per day, sufficient and nutritious, duties, cooking, laundry, mending, and field work as needed. Duration, no fixed term. Employee may leave with 1 week notice. Bonus, if employee remains for 2 full years, she shall receive 5% of all profits from cattle sales. Safety, owner pledges no violence or harassment of any kind. Violation of this term renders the contract void and requires payment of $100 to employee signature. William Garrett. Signature, Margaret Fletcher. Witness. To be obtained. Margaret Fletcher read through it twice, her lips moving slightly as she parsed each clause. Then she picked up the pencil and added a line at the bottom. Additional term. If owner must leave the property for more than 1 week due to emergency, employee shall have full management authority and shall receive $25 per month during that period. She looked up. "I want this included. If you need to travel to San Francisco to gather evidence against Whitmore, or for any other reason, the ranch should not suffer." Will read her addition and nodded slowly. "That is more than fair." Agreed. They both signed. The lack of a witness bothered Will, but he knew they could remedy that tomorrow by riding to see Reverend Stone in town. He stood and extended his hand. Margaret Fletcher took it. Her grip was firm and dry, the handshake of someone who understood the weight of agreements. "We are partners now," Will said. "Partners," she echoed. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they sat on the front porch in 2 old chairs Will had made from oak scraps. The evening air was finally cooling, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Will found himself talking more than he had in months. About Catherine, who had played piano beautifully and laughed like bells. About Daniel, who had been 5 years old and full of questions about everything from why grass was green to how far the stars were. About the fever that had taken them both in the span of 6 days while Will was in Sacramento buying medicine that arrived too late. Margaret Fletcher listened without platitudes or empty comfort. When he finished, she told him about John, who had loved Shakespeare and read it aloud by firelight, about the 15 years they tried for children, month after month of hope and disappointment, about raising Thomas after her brother's death, thinking she finally had a chance to be a mother, only to watch the boy grow into someone she barely recognized. "After John died, I burned all his books," she said quietly. "I could not bear to see them on the shelves, knowing I would never hear his voice reading them again. I have regretted it every day since." "I sold Catherine's piano," Will admitted. "I told myself it was for practical reasons. We needed the money, but really I just could not stand to look at it." They sat in silence as the sky turned orange and purple and finally deep blue. Stars began to emerge first, Venus bright in the west, then the familiar patterns of constellations Will had learned from his father. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance. Margaret Fletcher shivered slightly, and Will stood to get a blanket from inside. When he returned and draped it over her shoulders, his hand brushed the top of her arm. They both went still. It was the first real physical contact between them since the handshake. Just a touch, nothing more. But Will felt it like a jolt of electricity. He pulled his hand back quickly. I should let you rest. It has been a long day. It has. She stood holding the blanket around her shoulders. Thank you, Will, for everything. It was the first time she had used his given name. He liked the sound of it in her voice. Good night, Meg. He used the shortened form without thinking, then worried he had been too familiar. But she smiled. Good night. She went inside to her room. Will heard the soft click of the lock, engaging the sound of someone finally feeling safe enough to secure a door from the inside. He sat back down on the porch and looked out at the dark shapes of his land. The night was clear and cool, the kind of evening that made a man grateful for simple things. A roof, land, work to do, and now, unexpectedly, company. He was just starting to doze when he heard hoofbeats. His hand went to the rifle he kept beside his chair as a rider emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the stars. The man stopped at the edge of the porch, staying in shadow, but his voice was unmistakable. Mr. Garrett? It was one of Whitmore's men, a hard-looking character named Davidson, who ran the big ranch's security. Mr. Whitmore asked me to deliver a message. Will stood rifle at ready, but not aimed. I am listening. He wanted you to know that he has had the county surveyor review property lines in this area. Seems there is some question about where your northern boundary actually falls. The official survey may show that your fence is on his land, about 200 feet worth. That is impossible. I have the deed. The boundary runs from the Elder Oak to the Red Rock Formation in a straight line. Maybe, but Mr. Whitmore's surveyor says there are 2 Elder Oaks, and the original survey used the wrong one. He will be filing the corrected survey with the county next week. Davidson's smile was audible even in the darkness. Just thought you should know. Trespassing fees can add up. $1 a day is standard. Get off my land. Going, but one more thing. That woman you picked up today. The old one. Mr. Whitmore wanted me to mention that he knows some things about her nephew. Outstanding debts, legal troubles. Could be she is liable for some of those as family. Could be complicated for anyone harboring her. Will raised the rifle slightly. I said, get off my land. Davidson laughed and turned his horse. See you soon, Garrett, real soon. The hoofbeats faded into the night. Will stood on the porch for a long time after watching the darkness, his mind racing. Whitmore was moving faster than expected. The survey challenge was smart. If he could prove Will's fence was on Whitmore land, even by a technicality, he could levy fines until Will could not pay. Combined with taxes and normal expenses, it might be enough to force a sale. And the mention of Margaret Fletcher's nephew was a threat, pure and simple. Find some way to make her legally vulnerable, use that to pressure Will. It was a good strategy, ruthless and effective. Will looked back at the house where a lamp still glowed in Margaret Fletcher's window. He had made a promise today. Not just a contract, but something deeper. He had stood up when he saw injustice, the way he should have stood up for his father 5 years ago. He would not back down now. Tomorrow they would ride to see Reverend Stone and get the contract witnessed. Then they would go to the county clerk's office and pull the original survey documents. Margaret Fletcher had said she knew law. Good. They would need every bit of legal knowledge they could muster, but tonight Will allowed himself a moment of something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a man barely surviving, but the cautious hope of someone who had found an unexpected ally, who was no longer facing the world alone. Inside the house, Margaret Fletcher's lamp went out. Will sat back down in his chair rifle across his knees and began the first watch of what he suspected would be many long nights to come. Above him, the stars wheeled slowly across the vast California sky, the same stars that had watched over this land for thousands of years before any man claimed ownership. They would still be there long after Whitmore and Will and all their struggles had turned to dust. But right now in this moment, it mattered who held the deeds and who controlled the water and who had the strength to stand against corruption. Will Garrett intended to be standing when the dust settled. He owed it to his father's memory. He owed it to Margaret Fletcher's courage, and he owed it to himself. The night deepened. Somewhere, Owl called. The windmill creaked as it turned, and in the darkness beyond the fence line, unseen eyes watched the ranch calculating, planning, waiting for the next move in a game that was only just beginning. The first week of August brought temperatures that cracked the earth and turned the grass to brittle straw. By mid-morning, the thermometer on the barn wall read 105 degrees, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made distant mountains dance and waver like mirages. Will Garrett stood at the base of the north fence line, wiping sweat from his eyes with a bandana already soaked through. Beside him, Margaret Fletcher measured a fence post with practiced efficiency, her hands sure despite the heat. 53 inches, she called out. 2.5 feet in the ground, rest above. Mark it, Will said. They had been working since 5 in the morning when the eastern sky was just beginning to pale. Now 3 hours later, they had replaced 12 fence posts and had 40 more to go. The work was brutal in the heat, but necessary. Cattle did not respect sagging fences, and Will could not afford to lose even one animal to wandering. Meg set the marked post aside and reached for the iron digging bar. Will moved to take it from her, but she shook her head. I know how, she said simply. He watched as she positioned the bar above the spot they had chosen, raised it high, and drove it down into the hard earth with controlled force. The impact rang out across the valley. She repeated the motion, establishing a rhythm. Up, down, drive, turn, up, down, drive, turn. After 20 strikes, she had created a hole deep enough to check. She knelt beside it, measuring with her hand. 18 inches, halfway there. Will handed her the canteen. She drank without breaking the rhythm of her breathing, controlled inhalations and exhalations that spoke of someone who understood how to pace themselves through hard labor. Your husband taught you this, he asked. John taught me to use tools, but my father taught me to work. He ran a freight operation in Missouri before we moved west. I was loading wagons at age 12. She wiped her mouth and handed back the canteen. People see a woman and assume weakness. My father said assumptions were opportunity. Let them think you cannot, then show them you can. Will found himself smiling. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, though he did not live to see me prove him right. She picked up the digging bar again. Most men do not. They work through the morning, taking turns with the heavy tools, speaking little but moving in coordination that came more naturally each day. Will had worked with hired hands before, but never with this kind of seamless partnership. Meg anticipated what needed doing next, positioned herself where she would be most useful, asked questions only when clarification would prevent wasted effort. By noon, they had planted 25 new posts. Will called a halt for lunch, and they retreated to the shade of an old cottonwood that grew beside the irrigation ditch. The tree's leaves rustled in a faint breeze, providing blessed relief from the direct sun. Meg had packed bread and cheese and dried apples in a cloth bag. They ate in comfortable silence, watching a hawk circle high overhead, riding thermals, invisible to human eyes. Tell me about the well, Meg said after a while. You said you dug it yourself in 8 months. That is 65 feet through rock and earth. How did you manage alone? Will stretched his legs out, feeling the pleasant ache of muscles well used. The first 30 feet were relatively easy, dirt and clay soft enough to work with a shovel and pickaxe. But below that I hit bedrock. Had to use dynamite to blast through sections, then haul up the rubble in buckets. Dynamite, that is dangerous work. It is, but I learned it working for the railroad. They needed tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. I spent 6 months on a blasting crew. He looked at his hands, remembering the constant ringing in his ears, the taste of rock dust, the friends who had made small mistakes and paid with their lives. It taught me respect for explosives. You get one chance to place the charges correctly. And if you make a mistake, then someone else has to dig your grave. Meg absorbed this in silence. Then she said quietly, You have seen death. It was not a Christian show. Will nodded. The railroad was dangerous, but nothing compared to the war. My father was at Gettysburg. He saw things that gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. He used to wake up screaming, thinking he was back in the wheat field at dawn on the second day. Will picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers. When Catherine and Daniel died, he told me that war deaths and fever deaths were different kinds of loss. War took men in their prime fighting for something larger. Fever just took without reason or purpose. He said the second kind was harder to bear. Was he right? Will considered. I do not know. Dead is dead. But I think he meant that senseless loss is harder to give meaning to, harder to carry forward. And do you carry it forward? Every day. He met her eyes. Do you behave? Every day, she echoed. The hawk above them cried out a sharp sound that carried across the valley. They watched it stoop towards something in the grass, wings folded a blur of deadly precision. Then it rose again, something small, clutched in its talons. The world is not kind, Meg said. No, but we can be. She looked at him then, and something passed between them. An understanding. An acknowledgement that they were both people who had survived unkindness and chosen despite everything not to become it. They returned to work. The fence line grew straighter, stronger. By evening, when the sun finally dropped behind the western peaks and the temperature began its slow decline, they had completed the entire 200-foot section. Will walked the length of it, testing each post, checking the tension on the barbed wire. Everything held firm. This fence would last 10 years if properly maintained. Good work, he said. Meg was cleaning the tools, wiping dirt and sweat from the iron bar and shovel. We make a good team. We do. That night, after a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, they sat on the porch as had become their habit. The stars were brilliant in the clear air, the Milky Way, a river of light flowing across the sky. My husband used to say you could navigate by the stars if you knew how to read them, Meg said. He learned from sailors in San Francisco back when we first moved to California. He would point out constellations and tell me their stories. Orion the hunter, Cassiopeia the queen, Ursa Major the great bear. Can you still find them? Some. There's Polaris. She pointed to the North Star steady and bright. And there the Big Dipper. My father called it the drinking gourd. Said escaped slaves used it to navigate to freedom before the war. Will found himself leaning slightly closer to follow the line of her arm. My father taught me to use it to tell time. The way it rotates around Polaris through the night, you can measure hours by its position. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky wheel slowly overhead. Then Meg said, I have been thinking about what that man said last night, about the survey. Do you truly believe Whitmore can prove your fence is on his land? I do not know what he can prove, but I know what the truth is. My deed is clear. The boundary runs from the Elder Oak to the Red Rock Formation. There is only one Elder Oak. I have walked that line a dozen times. Then we should go to the county clerk tomorrow and pull the original survey records. Compare them to whatever Whitmore files. That is a day's ride to Riverside and back. Then we ride, Meg said firmly. We cannot fight what we do not understand. If Whitmore is planning legal action, we need to know exactly what we are facing. Will looked at her profile in the starlight. You are not afraid of this fight. I am terrified, she said simply, but fear never stopped work from needing doing. Before Will could respond, they heard hoofbeats approaching from the south. Both of them tensed. It was past 9 o'clock, too late for casual visits. Will stood and reached for his rifle. Meg rose as well, moving to stand beside him rather than behind him. He noticed and felt something warm in his chest. 5 riders emerged from the darkness into the pool of lamplight that spilled from the house windows. Davidson sat astride the lead horse, his face shadowed by his hat brim. The 4 men with him were all cut from the same cloth. Hard men hired for muscle rather than farming. Evening, Garrett, Davidson called out. Mrs. Fletcher? State your business, Willis said, keeping the rifle pointed at the ground but ready. Mr. Whitmore sent me with some papers, legal documents. Davidson held up a leather portfolio. Thought you might want to see them before they are filed with the county tomorrow. Leave them on the fence post and go on. Now that is not very neighborly. Davidson dismounted, moving with deliberate slowness. We came all this way. Least you can do is hear us out. He walked to the porch steps and held out the portfolio. Will did not take it. Open it and show me, Will said. Davidson shrugged and unfastened the leather ties. He pulled out several sheets of official-looking paper covered in dense text and technical diagrams. This here is the corrected survey of property boundaries between Whitmore Ranch and Garrett Ranch, prepared by Harold Price, licensed county surveyor. He held up a map that showed Will's property and the adjoining land. A thick red line marked what was labeled as the true boundary. As you can see, Davidson continued, the original 1884 survey incorrectly identified the elder oak tree used as the northern boundary marker. There are, in fact, two elder oaks in proximity approximately 300 feet apart. The correct tree is the eastern one. Using that as the reference point, your fence is actually 200 feet onto Whitmore property. Will studied the map without touching it. The diagram looked professional, complete with surveyor's marks and mathematical calculations. But something about it felt wrong. Before he could speak, Meg stepped forward. "May I see that?" Davidson glanced at her dismissively but handed over the map. Meg held it up to the lamplight, examining every detail. "This survey is dated August 12th, 1885, she said. "That is 2 days from now. Predated for filing purposes. And it is signed by Harold Price. Is Mr. Price related to Charles Whitmore by any chance?" Davidson's expression flickered. "Price is his brother-in-law, but that does not make him less qualified. He is a licensed surveyor." "I am sure he is." Meg set the map down on the porch railing and pointed to the bottom corner. "But this survey is not valid without the signature of the county clerk, which I do not see anywhere on this document." Davidson picked up the map and checked. His jaw tightened. "Administrative oversight will be corrected before filing." "Perhaps, but until it is, this is just a piece of paper with drawings on it. No legal weight whatsoever." Meg's voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Furthermore, under the California Land Act of 1872, any property owner has 60 days from the filing date of a new survey to challenge its findings. During those 60 days, the original survey remains in force." "You seem to know a lot about land law for a woman." My husband was very thorough in his education. He believed knowledge was power." Meg crossed her arms. "So even if Mr. Whitmore files this survey with the county clerk's signature tomorrow, Mr. Garrett will have 60 days to challenge it. And during that time, his fence is exactly where it should be. No trespassing, no fees." Davidson stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are smarter than you look, old woman." "And you are exactly as smart as you look," Meg replied evenly. One of the other riders snickered. Davidson shot him a glare that shut him up immediately. "Fine," Davidson said. "You get your 60 days, but that just delays the inevitable. Sooner or later, you will run out of money and time. And when you do, Mr. Whitmore will be waiting with a very reasonable offer for this property." "We are not selling," Will said. "Everyone sells eventually." Davidson mounted his horse. "Oh, and one more thing. Mr. Whitmore wanted me to mention that he has been doing some research into outstanding debts in the region. Seems there are quite a few people who owe money they cannot pay. He is thinking about buying up those debts, collecting what he is owed." The threat was clear. Find leverage. Apply pressure. "You have delivered your message," Will said. "Now get off my land." Davidson touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Until next time, Garrett, Mrs. Fletcher." The 5 riders disappeared into the darkness. Will and Meg stood on the porch listening to the hoofbeats fade. "He will come back," Meg said quietly. "I know. And next time it will be worse." "I know that too." Meg turned to face him. "Well, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "All right. Why are you really fighting Whitmore? This ranch is worth perhaps $2,000 at market value. He has offered you more. You could sell, take the money, buy land somewhere else. Start fresh without this constant threat." She paused. "So why stay?" Will looked out at the dark shapes of his land, the barn he had repaired, the well he had dug, the fences he had mended. Every board and post and stone represented hours of his labor, drops of his sweat, pieces of his life poured into this earth. "Because my father taught me that a man stands for something or he stands for nothing," he said finally. He stood for this land, for the idea that honest work and fair dealing should be enough. Whitmore took that from him with fraud and corruption. If I sell now, I am saying that fraud wins, that corruption wins. That might makes right." He shook his head. "I cannot do that. I will not. Even if it costs you everything." Even then. Meg was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good, because I would not respect you if you answered differently." She went inside to her room. Will heard the lock click. He sat back down on the porch, rifle across his knees, and began the night watch they had agreed upon. Meg would relieve him at 2 in the morning. Together they would keep the ranch safe. The August night was cool and clear. Coyotes sang in the distance. An owl called from the cottonwood by the irrigation ditch. The windmill creaked as it turned pumping water up from 65 feet below the lifeblood of everything they were trying to build. Will found himself thinking about partnership, about trust, about the strange alchemy that had taken two broken people and made them into something stronger than either was alone. He thought about how Meg had stepped forward tonight, not behind him, but beside him. How she had faced down 5 armed men with nothing but knowledge and courage. How she had earned Davidson's grudging respect through sheer competence. He thought about Catherine, who had been delicate and artistic and utterly unsuited for ranch life. He had loved her desperately, but he had always known she was fragile. She needed protecting, sheltering from the harsh realities of the world. Meg was different. Meg was steel wrapped in weathered skin. She did not need protecting. She needed partnership. The distinction mattered more than he had realized. At 2 in the morning, Meg emerged from the house wrapped in a shawl carrying the shotgun Will had given her. She knew how to use it. John Fletcher had taught her that too. Anything, she asked. Quiet. Too quiet, maybe. Go sleep. I will wake you at 6. Will started to go inside, then stopped. Meg, thank you. For tonight. For standing with me. Where else would I stand? She said simply. He went to his room and fell asleep within minutes, the deep sleep of someone who knew they were not alone on watch. The next morning, they rode to Riverside together. The journey took 4 hours through heat that built steadily as the sun climbed. By the time they reached the county clerk's office, the temperature was pushing 110 degrees. The clerk was a tired-looking man in his 50s named Robert Chen. He remembered Will from the land purchase the previous year. Mr. Garrett, what brings you to town? I need to see the original survey for my property, the 1884 survey done when I purchased the land. Chen nodded and disappeared into the back room. He returned 10 minutes later with a large, leather-bound book and several rolled maps. Here we are. Garrett Ranch purchased September 1884. 240 acres boundaries as follows. He unrolled the map on the counter. Will and Meg studied it carefully. The survey showed clear reference points. The northern boundary was described as running from the elder oak, approximate age 150 years, 6 feet diameter, at base located at coordinates, to the Red Rock Formation, approximate height 40 feet located at coordinates. A straight line connected the 2 points. Is there any mention of a second elder oak? Meg asked. Chen checked the written description. No, just the one. And it is quite specific about the size and age. An oak that large and old would be distinctive. There would not be 2 of them in close proximity. May I see the surveyor's notes? Chen pulled out another document handwritten on official paper. The surveyor, a man named Thomas Whitney, had sketched the tree and noted its distinctive features. A scar on the trunk from an old lightning strike, unusual branch structure, deep roots that had created a raised area in the surrounding ground. Could we get a certified copy of this survey? Will asked. Of course, $5 for the full set of documents. Will paid. Chen prepared the copies, impressing each page with the official county seal. As they were leaving, Meg said casually, Mr. Chen, do you happen to know a surveyor named Harold Price? Price, yes, he is licensed in this county. Does work for several of the larger landowners. Is he considered reliable? Chen hesitated, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Then he said quietly, Price does the work he is paid to do, if you understand my meaning. I do, thank you. Outside, they stood in the shade of the courthouse overhang, looking at the certified copies. We have proof, Will said. The original survey is clear, one tree well documented. If Whitmore tries to file his fake survey, we can challenge it with this. Yes, but challenges take time and money, lawyers, court fees. Whitmore knows that. He is counting on bleeding us dry through the process. So what do we do? Meg thought for a moment. We need to make the challenge impossible to ignore. If it is just us against Whitmore, he wins through attrition. But if we can get others involved, other landowners who might face similar fraud, the community, the newspapers. She looked at him. We need to make this bigger than one ranch. How? I am not sure yet, but I am thinking. They rode home in the worst heat of the day, arriving back at the ranch in late afternoon. Both of them were exhausted and sunburned, but they had what they needed, proof, ammunition for the fight ahead. That evening, Meg made a simple dinner while Will checked on the cattle. When he returned to the house, he found her at the table writing on a piece of paper. "What is that?" he asked. "A letter to the Sacramento Herald. They are the largest newspaper in Northern California. If we can get them interested in a story about land fraud, about a wealthy banker systematically cheating small farmers, it might create pressure Whitmore cannot ignore." Will sat down across from her. "That is good thinking, but newspapers need sources, people willing to go on record." "I know. We would need to find others Whitmore has defrauded. Get them to tell their stories." She set down her pen. "It is risky. He could retaliate. He is already retaliating." True. They worked on the letter together, crafting careful language that was factual but compelling. Meg's knowledge of legal terminology helped them avoid defamation while still making their case clear. When they finished, it was late. They sat on the porch in the cooling air, neither ready for sleep despite the long day. The next morning brought no relief from the August heat. "You should have woken me," he said. "You needed sleep. I could not give you much else, but I could give you that." After a quick breakfast, Will headed to the north pasture to check on the cattle while Meg volunteered to inventory the hay stores in the barn loft. They would need to know exactly how much feed they had before winter arrived. "Be careful up there," Will called as she climbed the ladder. "Some of those boards look questionable when I checked last month." "I am always careful," Meg replied. Will was halfway to the pasture when he heard it. Not a scream exactly, more like a sharp cry of surprise cut short. His blood turned to ice. He ran back toward the barn, his boots pounding the hard earth. "Meg!" Inside the barn, he looked up and saw her. Meg hung from a support beam 15 feet above the concrete floor, both hands gripping the wood splinters driven deep into her palms. Below her, a splintered hole gaped in the loft floor where rotten planks had given way. "Hold on," Will shouted, already scrambling up the ladder. "I am trying," Meg gasped. Her arms were shaking with the strain. Will threw himself flat on the loft floor, distributing his weight to avoid more collapse. He stretched his arms towards her, his fingers just barely reaching her wrists. "Look at me, Meg. Look at me." Her eyes found his wide with fear, but steady. "I have got you. On three, I am going to pull. Do not let go. 1, 2, 3. Will hauled with everything he had. Meg's weight, slight as she was, felt immense at this angle. His shoulders screamed in protest. His fingers dug into her wrists hard enough to bruise. But inch by agonizing inch, he pulled her up until she could get one elbow onto the loft floor, then the other. The moment she was safe, Will dragged her away from the hole and into his arms. His whole body was shaking. "God," he whispered into her hair. "I thought I lost you. I cannot lose you, Meg. I cannot." Meg was trembling too, her breath coming in gasps. "I am all right. I am here." But Will could not let go. He held her tighter, feeling her heart race against his chest. When he finally pulled back enough to see her face, his hands were still shaking as he cupped her cheeks. "You have to know," he said, the words tumbling out. "Meg, I need you, not just for the ranch, not just for the work. I need you because I cannot go back to being alone. I would not survive it. Not again. Will, I love you." The confession broke from him like a dam bursting. "I love your strength and your wisdom and the way you stand beside me instead of behind me. I love how you see the world and how you refuse to be invisible. I love Catherine and Daniel. I will always carry them with me. But I love you too, and I almost just lost you, and I—" Meg pulled him down and kissed him. It was desperate and raw and real. Two people who had both thought they were done with feeling anything this intense. When they broke apart, both were crying. "I love you too," Meg whispered. "I did not think I would ever say those words again. But I love you, William Garrett." They sat there in the dusty loft for a long time, holding each other, listening to their hearts slow to normal rhythms. Finally, Meg said quietly, "We should fix that hole before someone else falls through." Will laughed, shaky but genuine. "Always practical. One of us has to be." She looked at him, her expression softening. "Though I am glad you are not always practical." They climbed down from the loft together. Will examined Meg's hands, picking out splinters and wrapping them in clean cloth. His own hands were steadier now, but something had fundamentally shifted between them. That evening they sat on the porch as had become their habit, but tonight they sat closer. Will's arm around Meg's shoulders. her head resting against his chest. I have been thinking, Will said, about what I want, about what comes after we win this fight with the Whitmore. He paused. I want this, you and me. Not as employer and employee, not even just as partners. Meg lifted her head to look at him. What are you saying? I am saying, Will took a breath, that when this is over, when Whitmore is dealt with, and we can breathe again, I want to ask you something important. And I hope you will say yes. Meg smiled, her eyes bright in the lamplight. I think I already know the question, and I think you already know the answer. They sat in comfortable silence watching the stars emerge, knowing that their lives had just shifted in a direction neither had expected, but both desperately wanted. Tell me something, Meg said. If we win this fight with Whitmore, if we keep the ranch and make it profitable and build something lasting, what then? What do you want this life to become? It was a good question. Will realized he had been so focused on survival that he had not thought about actual thriving. What came after merely holding on? I suppose I want this ranch to be a place that matters, he said slowly. Not just for profit, though that is important, but as a place that stands for something, where people are treated fairly, where work is respected, where someone like you would not have to fear being sold for flour. A legacy, Meg said softly. Yes, a legacy. He looked at her. What about you? What do you want? I want to stop being invisible, she said. I want to be seen, valued. I want my work to matter. She paused, searching for words. I want to belong somewhere, truly belong, not just be tolerated or used. You belong here, Will said. The words came out before he thought about them, but once said he realized they were absolutely true. You belong here, Meg. She turned to face him, and in the lamplight, spilling from the windows, he saw her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Do I? Yes. They sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down. Will felt something shifting between them, some wall crumbling. The careful distance of employer and employee was giving way to something more complex, more real. Before either of them could speak again, they heard hoofbeats, but this time the sound was frantic, desperate. A single rider pushing a horse hard. They both stood. Will grabbed his rifle. The rider burst into the yard, a young woman barely staying in the saddle. She pulled up hard, the horse blowing and covered in lather. Help, she gasped. Please, I need help. She slid from the saddle and collapsed. Will and Meg rushed forward. The girl could not have been more than 22 with fair hair and a face twisted in fear. Are you hurt? Meg asked, checking her for injuries. No, not hurt, but he will come for me. He will send men. She grabbed Meg's arm. Please do not send me back. Please. Slow down, Will said. Who is coming? What happened? The girl took a shaking breath. My name is Eleanor Mason. Most people call me Nell. My father is Samuel Mason. He owns a small farm 10 miles west of here. He owes Charles Whitmore $400 for a seed loan. Will and Meg exchanged glances. Another debt. Another person in Whitmore's trap. Whitmore said if I married his son Robert, he would forgive the debt, Nell continued, but I refused. So he told my father he would foreclose on our farm and have my father arrested for theft. Said he had witnesses who would swear my father stole cattle. It is a lie, all lies. But my father is sick. A trial would kill him. So you ran, Meg said gently. I took Robert's horse while he was in San Francisco. I know it was wrong stealing, but I had nowhere else to go, and I heard, she looked at Will. I heard you helped Mrs. Fletcher, that you were a good man. I hoped maybe you would help me too. Will looked at this terrified girl, then at the exhausted horse, then at Meg. He saw the answer in her eyes before she spoke. Of course we will help you, Meg said. Come inside. Let us get you cleaned up and fed. You are safe here. But Whitmore, Nell said, he will come for the horse. He will press charges. Let him come, Will said grimly. We seem to be collecting reasons for him to hate us. What is one more, sorry? They brought Nell inside. Meg gave her water and a plate of food while Will tended to the horse. The animal was a fine bay gelding, well-bred and expensive. Robert Whitmore's personal mount, if Nell was to be believed. When the horse was cooled down and watered and put in the barn, Will returned to the house. Nell was telling Meg about her father, about the farm, about how Whitmore had been systematically buying up debts and foreclosing on properties throughout the valley. He wants all of it, she said. Every farm, every ranch. He has been telling people it is for their own good, that he is consolidating land to protect the valley from outside interests. But really, he just wants control. Outside interest, Will asked. The railroad. Southern Pacific is planning a branch line through this region. Whitmore wants to own all the land along the route so he can sell it back to the railroad at enormous profit. Will felt like he had been punched. Suddenly, Whitmore's obsession with acquiring properties made perfect sense. It was not about farming, it was about the railroad right-of-way. Control all the land the railroad needed, force them to pay whatever price you demanded. How do you know this, he asked. Robert brags when he is drunk. He thinks I am too stupid to understand business. But I listened. I remember. Meg, Will said, if this is true, we are not just fighting over one ranch. We are fighting over the future of the entire valley. I know. Meg's expression was grim, which means Whitmore will not stop until he has what he wants. They made up a bed for Nell in the main room and let her sleep. Tomorrow they would figure out what to do about the horse and Whitmore's inevitable response. But tonight they gave the girl what she needed most. Safety, rest, the knowledge that someone would stand between her and harm. Will and Meg returned to the porch for their watch rotation. 2 in the morning had come and gone. They sat together in the darkness, both too wired to sleep. This is getting complicated, Will said. It was always complicated. We just did not see the full picture. What do? We keep fighting. We protect Nell. We gather evidence. We go public with what Whitmore is doing. Meg leaned back in her chair. And we hope we survive long enough to see it through. Will reached out and took her hand. She did not pull away. They sat there in the darkness, fingers intertwined, drawing strength from contact. I am glad you are here, he said quietly. I am glad I am here too. The stars wheeled overhead. The night deepened, and somewhere in the distance, plans were being made in a mansion office, strategies devised, pressure points identified. But for now, in this moment, Will Garrett and Margaret Fletcher sat together in the darkness and held on to each other in the land they had both chosen to defend. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The October night came down cold and moonless. Will stood in the barn doorway checking the hay stores for winter when he heard Meg's voice cut through the darkness. Will, riders coming, at least 10 of them. He dropped the pitchfork and ran to the house. Meg stood on the porch, the shotgun in her hands, her face calm but alert. Nell emerged from inside, pale but steady. Get inside and bar the door, Will told Nell. Stay away from the windows. I am not hiding, Nell said. This is because of me. I should face it. You will face nothing tonight, Meg said firmly. Inside. Now. Nell retreated reluctantly. Will took up position beside Meg as torches appeared in the darkness, bobbing like malevolent fireflies. The riders formed a semicircle around the ranch house, cutting off any escape route. Charles Whitmore himself sat at the center on his black stallion, his silver hair catching the torchlight. He wore a long coat, despite the cold, looking every inch the wealthy landowner come to collect what he believed was owed. Garrett, Whitmore called out, I am here for Eleanor Mason, horse theft. I have a warrant for her arrest. Sheriff Cook sat mounted beside Whitmore, his face troubled in the flickering light. He held up a piece of paper. It is true, Garrett. Whitmore filed a complaint. I have to follow the law. She returned the horse, Will said, his voice carrying across the yard. It is in my barn right now unharmed. No theft occurred. The horse was taken without permission, Whitmore countered. That is theft under California law. She will stand trial. Meg stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. California Penal Code Section 487 defines grand theft as taking property with intent to permanently deprive the owner. Miss Mason returned the horse within 24 hours. There was no intent to permanently deprive. Therefore, no crime. Whitmore's smile was cold. Always the lawyer, Mrs. Fletcher. But I have something else to discuss. Your nephew, Thomas Fletcher, is wanted in San Bernardino County for debt fraud. He borrowed $200 on a false promissory note 2 years ago. There is a warrant for his arrest. And under California Civil Code Section 1656, family members can be held liable for debts of blood relatives. Thomas is not here, Meg said. But you are. And unless you sign over any property rights you hold, including your profit-sharing agreement with Garrett, I will ensure the warrant is executed. You will be held responsible for your nephew's debts." Will felt rage building in his chest. This was blackmail, pure and simple. Whitmore was manufacturing legal pressures using the complexity of the law as a weapon against people who could not afford lawyers. He stepped forward, placing himself between Meg and the mounted men. "No." Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "No. Mrs. Fletcher signs nothing. Miss Mason faces no charges. You are done threatening people on my land." "Your land," Whitmore laughed. "That is the heart of it, is it not? You think this patch of dirt makes you someone. You think you can stand against me because you dug a well and built some fences. But you are nothing, Garrett. A railroad worker playing at being a rancher. You do not have the resources to fight me. You do not have the connections. You do not even have the money to last through winter." Will waited until Whitmore finished. Then he said, his voice carrying to every writer present, "Everyone here needs to listen carefully. Charles Whitmore has been systematically defrauding landowners in this valley for 5 years. He uses fake surveys to claim property boundaries are wrong. He uses altered loan documents to foreclose on ranches. He forces young women into marriages to collect debts their fathers cannot pay." "You have no proof of any of that," Whitmore said. "I have all the proof." Will pulled a leather folder from inside his coat. "2 weeks ago, I went to the county clerk's office. I pulled the original survey of my property. I also pulled the surveys of every property you have foreclosed on in the last 5 years. I found a pattern. In every case, your surveyor, Harold Price, who happens to be your brother-in-law, found errors that benefited you. In every case, small farmers suddenly owed more than they could pay." He held up the folder. "I have certified copies of original loan documents that show amounts different from what you claimed. I have affidavits from 3 landowners willing to testify that you altered their debts. I have a notarized statement from a former employee of your bank describing how you instructed him to forge signatures." Whitmore's face had gone rigid. "Where did you get that?" "That does not matter. What matters is that I sent copies of everything to the Sacramento Herald 3 days ago. A reporter named James Mitchell will be here next week to interview witnesses. And I sent copies to the California State Banking Commission. They are very interested in your business practices, Mr. Whitmore." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift in the air. Sheriff Cook spoke up, his voice rough. "Is this true, Whitmore? Did you forge loan documents?" "Of course not. This is slander. I will sue him for every penny he has." "Then you will not mind if I look at his evidence," Cook said. He dismounted and walked toward Will, hand extended. Will gave him the folder. The sheriff moved closer to one of the torches and began reading. His expression grew darker with each page. "These documents have county clerk seals," Cook said finally. "They are certified copies of official records, and they show clear discrepancies between original loan amounts and the amounts you claimed were owed." He looked up at Whitmore, and Will saw something change in the sheriff's face. A decision being made, a line being crossed. "Whitmore, did you pay me $50 a month on top of my county salary?" Whitmore went very still. "What are you suggesting?" "I am not suggesting anything. I am asking a direct question. Did you pay me extra money?" "I made donations to the sheriff's office for equipment and supplies." "Donations that went directly into my pocket." Cook's voice was heavy with self-disgust. "I knew something was wrong. I told myself it was just business, that you were helping the community grow, that the ends justified the means, but I was lying to myself." He ripped the warrant for Nell's arrest in half. "This warrant is invalid. It was obtained under false pretenses. Miss Mason committed no crime." "You are making a mistake, Sheriff." "No, the mistake was taking your money in the first place." Cook removed his badge and dropped it on the ground. "I resign, effective immediately. I will not be part of this anymore." Whitmore's control was slipping. Will could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the white-knuckle grip on his reins. "You think one former sheriff and some old documents will stop me? I have 10 men here. You have yourself and 2 women. If I wanted to burn this barn right now, what would you do?" "He would have help." The voice came from the darkness beyond the torchlight. A man stepped forward carrying a rifle. Will recognized him as Samuel Mason Nell's father. He was gaunt and walked with a cane, but his eyes were clear and determined. You took my farm in 1883 Whitmore. $400 debt that you claimed was 800. I could not prove the fraud then, but I can now. Another man emerged from the shadows. You foreclosed on my land in 1882, claimed I owed 1,200 when I only borrowed 600. Then another and another. 15 men in total, all farmers and ranchers who had lost property to Whitmore's schemes. They formed a line between the mounted riders and the ranch house. Samuel Mason spoke for all of them. We are done being victims. We are done being afraid. You want to burn Garrett's barn? You will have to go through all of us, and there will be witnesses and reporters and the State Banking Commission. Are you prepared for that kind of attention, Whitmore? Whitmore looked at the line of men at the former sheriff standing with them at Will and Meg on the porch. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and for the first time in years, genuinely threatened. This is not over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Legal battles take years. They cost thousands of dollars. Do you really think you can outlast me in court? I think justice does not have a price tag, Will said. And I think you are about to find out what it costs to build an empire on lies. Whitmore yanked his horse's head around and spurred away into the darkness. His riders followed the torches receding like dying stars. The farmers waited until the last hoofbeats faded. Then Samuel Mason turned to Will and extended his hand. Thank you, he said simply, for protecting my daughter and for having the courage to stand up first. We stand together or we fall alone, Will replied, shaking his hand. The men dispersed slowly, heading back to their own properties. Cook was the last to leave. He picked up his badge from the dirt and handed it to Will. Give this to whoever they appoint next. Tell them to do better than I did. You did the right thing in the end, Will said. That counts for something. Maybe. Cook mounted his horse. I will testify when the reporter comes. I owe you that much. When everyone was gone, Nell came out of the house and ran to hug Meg, then Will. Thank you, she sobbed. Thank you both. You are family now, Meg said, stroking her hair. Family protects each other. They went inside. Nell fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from fear and relief. Will and Meg sat at the kitchen table, the adrenaline slowly draining from their systems. That was close, Meg said. It was, but we won. Will reached across the table and took her hand. We won because you were here, because you knew the law, because you stood beside me. Where else would I stand? They sat in silence for a moment. Then Will said, Meg, I need to tell you something. Back in the barn before the riders came, I was checking the hay stores and I was thinking about winter, about having enough feed for the cattle, about making it through to spring. He paused, and I realized that for the first time in 3 years, I was not just thinking about survival. I was thinking about what comes after, about building something that lasts. What are you saying? I am saying that tonight proved we cannot wait any longer. We have stood against Whitmore together. We have built this ranch together, and I want to make it official. He tightened his grip on her hand. Meg, we have talked around this since the barn. Since I told you I loved you, and you said you loved me too. Now I am asking properly. He stood and came around the table, kneeling beside her chair. Margaret Fletcher, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, not someday when things are safer, but now? As soon as we can get to Reverend Stone. Meg's eyes filled with tears. Well, I am 55 years old. I cannot give you children. I cannot give you I want you exactly as you are. Your strength, your wisdom, your courage, everything that makes you who you are. He cupped her face. We do not know what tomorrow brings. Tonight showed us that. So I am asking now. Marry me, Meg. Are you certain? I have never been more certain of anything. Meg cupped his face in her work-roughened hands. Yes, God help me, yes. I will marry you, William Garrett. They kissed, then tentative at first, then with growing passion. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. When Meg asked, as soon as possible, before Whitmore finds some way to stop us. The next morning there was a knock at the door. Will opened it to find Thomas Fletcher standing on the porch, hat in hand, looking like he had not slept in days. Aunt Meg, he said when he saw her, I heard about the warrant. About Whitmore saying I am wanted for fraud. It is a lie. I never borrowed money in San Bernardino, but I came because I needed to tell you something I should have said months ago. He fell to his knees. I am sorry. I sold you for a bag of flour. I let my wife convince me you were a burden when you were the only person who ever truly cared for me. I was weak and cowardly, and I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for it anyway. Meg stood silent for a long moment. Will could see the war in her face, the hurt, the anger, the love she still held for the nephew she had raised. Then she stepped forward and pulled Thomas to his feet. Stand up. Fletcher men do not kneel. I am not worthy to be called a Fletcher. That is for me to decide, not you. She looked him in the eyes. I forgave you the day Will brought me here. Holding anger takes too much energy, and life is too short to waste on bitterness. Thomas broke down crying. Meg held him while he sobbed, this grown man who had finally found the courage to face what he had done. When he could speak again, Thomas said, My wife left me, said I was too weak to be worth her time. She was right. Then prove her wrong, Will said. Stay here, work with us. Earn back your self-respect through honest labor. I cannot pay you. We do not need payment. We need hands. Winter is coming. There is more work than two people can handle. Will extended his hand. $15 a month plus room and board. But you pull your weight or you leave. No exceptions. Thomas shook his hand, gripping hard. I will not let you down. I swear it. 2 days later, Reverend Marcus Stone married Will and Meg in his small church. The ceremony was simple. Samuel Mason and Nell stood as witnesses. Thomas was there along with a handful of townspeople who had heard about the confrontation with Whitmore and wanted to show support. Reverend Stone spoke about second chances, about finding love when you least expected it, about the courage it took to build something new from the ashes of loss. When he asked if Will took Meg as his wife, Will said, I do, and I promise to see you, value you, and love you until my last breath. When Meg gave her vows, her voice was strong and clear. I do. I promise to stand beside you, work with you, and love you fiercely for as long as I live. They exchanged simple gold bands that Will had purchased with the last of his savings. When Reverend Stone pronounced them, husband and wife, Will pulled Meg close and kissed her thoroughly, not caring who was watching. The small gathering applauded. Nell was crying happy tears. Thomas smiled for the first time in months. That night, in the privacy of the bedroom they would now share, Will and Meg came together as husband and wife. Their lovemaking was tender and passionate, two people who had both thought their time for such things had passed, discovering that desire had no expiration date. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Meg's head on his chest, Will felt something settle in his soul, a completeness he had not known he was missing. I love you, Miss Garrett, he whispered. I love you too, Mr. Garrett. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time in 3 years, Will did not dream of loss. Winter came to the valley with unusual gentleness. There was rain, but no blizzards, cold, but not the bone-deep freeze that could kill cattle and ruin crops. The ranch settled into a rhythm of work and rest, the four of them becoming a makeshift family. Thomas proved his worth, taking on the hardest task without complaint. Nell learned ranch work from Meg, becoming the daughter Meg had never had. And Will and Meg worked side by side, their partnership deepening with each shared sunrise. In late January, James Mitchell from the Sacramento Herald arrived to investigate Whitmore's activities. He spent 3 days interviewing witnesses, examining documents, photographing the evidence. When he left, he promised a full expose in the next edition. The article appeared 2 weeks later. The headline read, Empire of Fraud, How One Man Systematically Stole a Valley. Mitchell had done thorough work. The piece detailed 15 separate cases of fraudulent foreclosure. It exposed the fake surveys, the altered loan documents, the forced marriages. It quoted Sheriff Cook's confession. It named Harold Price as a co-conspirator. Most damaging of all, it revealed Whitmore's plan to monopolize land along the proposed railroad right-of-way, effectively holding the Southern Pacific Railroad hostage for inflated prices. The response was immediate. The California State Banking Commission launched a formal investigation. 3 state marshals arrived in Riverside to execute arrest warrants, and the railroad company, furious at the attempted extortion, filed civil suits seeking damages. Charles Whitmore was arrested on February 10, 1886, charged with bank fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to defraud. His son Robert fled to San Francisco and was never seen in Riverside again. The bank was placed in receivership while investigators untangled 5 years of corrupt dealings. The trial took 3 months. Whitmore hired expensive lawyers, but the evidence was overwhelming. In May, he was convicted on 14 counts and sentenced to 7 years in state prison. His banking license was revoked. His property was seized to pay restitution to his victims. Among the properties returned was the original Garrett family ranch, 160 acres along the river. The court found that the 1880 foreclosure had been based on fraudulent debt and was therefore void. Will stood on the land his father had cleared and planted, feeling the old man's presence like a hand on his shoulder. This was justice, late but real. He decided to keep both properties, expanding Garrett Ranch to 400 acres total. With good water, good land, and good help, it would be one of the most productive operations in the valley. But the greatest surprise came in mid-February when Meg woke feeling nauseated and weak. She assumed it was a winter illness, perhaps influenza, making its rounds. After 2 weeks of persistent symptoms, Will insisted she see Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the elderly physician who had practiced in Riverside for 40 years. Hayes examined Meg in his office while Will waited outside pacing the worn floorboards. When the door finally opened, the doctor's expression was stunned. "Mr. Garrett, you should come in." Will entered to find Meg sitting on the examination table, her face pale, her hands shaking. "What is wrong?" he demanded. "What is it?" "Nothing is wrong," Hayes said slowly. "Quite the opposite. Your wife is pregnant." Will felt the world tilt. "That is impossible. She is 55. We have only been married 3 months. I am aware of both facts, and yet the symptoms are unmistakable. I would estimate she is approximately 10 weeks along." Hayes shook his head in wonder. "I have seen 3 cases of pregnancy over age 50 in my career. It is rare, but it happens. Usually when a woman believes she is entering menopause and therefore takes no precautions." Will looked at Meg. "A baby. A baby," she whispered. "Well, I never conceived in 35 years of marriage to John. I thought I was barren. This should not be possible." Hayes cleared his throat. "I must warn you both. Pregnancy at this age is extremely dangerous. The risks of hemorrhage, preeclampsia, and stillbirth are significantly elevated. I will need to monitor you closely. Weekly examinations at minimum, and at the first sign of complications, complete bed rest." "I understand," Meg said. Will could not speak. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her while his mind spun with the impossibility of it. A child. His child. Their child. When they returned to the ranch, Nell and Thomas saw their faces and demanded to know what was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," Meg said, a smile breaking through her shock. "Everything is right. We are going to have a baby." Nell shrieked with joy and hugged them both. Thomas pumped Will's hand, grinning like a fool. That night, alone in their room, Will placed his hand on Meg's still flat stomach. "I thought I would never have this again," he said quietly. "After Daniel died, I thought that part of my life was over. I thought I would never have it at all." Meg covered his hand with hers. "Are you frightened?" "Terrified." But also, he searched for the word grateful. So grateful. The pregnancy progressed through spring and into summer. Meg's belly swelled, and with it grew a fierce protectiveness in everyone around her. Will would not let her lift anything heavier than a wash basin. Thomas took over all the heavy ranch work. Nell appointed herself Meg's personal guardian, monitoring her rest and nutrition with military precision. Dr. Hayes visited weekly, checking Meg's blood pressure, listening to the baby's heartbeat, watching for signs of complications. In June, at the Harvest Festival, Will presented Meg with a gift he had commissioned from the town silversmith. A bracelet carved with 33 images, a mountain, a barn, and a woman standing tall and strong. "You were never too old," he told her in front of the assembled town. "You are exactly what I need, exactly what this land needs, and exactly what our child needs." The townspeople applauded. Even those who had mocked Meg at the auction now looked at her with respect. She had exposed corruption. She had helped save the valley from Whitmore's schemes. And now she stood as living proof that life could surprise you with blessings when you least expected them. But July brought the first real scare. Meg's blood pressure spiked dangerously high. Dr. Hayes ordered 2 weeks of complete bed rest. Will refused to leave her side. He moved a cot into their bedroom, sleeping within arm's reach. He read to her from the newspapers and books. He brought her meals and rubbed her swollen feet and told her stories about his father and Catherine and all the people who had shaped him. And Meg talked about John and the brother she had lost and the hard lessons of her 55 years. They learned each other's histories in those 2 weeks, filling in the gaps, building the foundation of a shared life. The crisis passed. Meg's blood pressure returned to acceptable levels. Dr. Hayes cautiously allowed her to resume light activity. In August, they had one final false alarm. Meg woke at 3 in the morning with strong contractions. Will rode through the darkness to fetch the doctor, his heart in his throat. But when Hayes examined her, he smiled. False labor, common in late pregnancy, but it means your body is preparing. The baby will come soon. How soon? Days, maybe a week. We'll return to the ranch to find Meg in the kitchen, calmly preparing breakfast, despite the fact that she had just given them all a terrible scare. Should you not be resting, he asked. I have been resting for months. Our son or daughter is coming soon, and I will not spend the last days lying in bed like an invalid. How do you know it will be soon? I know, she said simply. A mother knows. She was right. 2 days later, on a cool morning in late August, Meg's water broke. Will sent Thomas racing for Dr. Hayes while he and Nell prepared the bedroom. They had clean linens, ready boiled water towels, everything the doctor had told them to gather. Hayes arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand. He examined Meg and nodded. Full dilation. The baby is in position. Mrs. Garrett, when the next contraction comes, I need you to push. The labor lasted 14 hours. Will stayed by Meg's side despite Hayes' suggestion that he wait outside. This was his wife, his child. He would not be anywhere else. Meg was magnificent. She bore the pain with gritted teeth and fierce determination, squeezing Will's hands so hard he thought bones might break. But he did not complain. He simply held her and whispered encouragement and marveled at her strength. Near the end, there was bleeding. Too much bleeding. Hayes' expression grew worried. We need more towels, he said sharply, and be ready to apply pressure when the baby is delivered. What is wrong? Will demanded. Hemorrhaging, common in older mothers. I can manage it, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly as I say. The next contraction came. Meg screamed a raw sound of agony and effort. Push, Hayes commanded. Push now. Meg pushed with everything she had. Will saw the doctor's hands move, saw blood, too much blood, and then heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's cry. It is a boy, Hayes said, lifting the squalling infant. A healthy boy. He placed the baby on Meg's chest while he worked to stop the bleeding. Meg looked down at the tiny red face, the waving fist, the shock of dark hair, and began to cry. A son, she whispered. We have a son. Will touched the baby's tiny hand. The fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. What should we name him? Meg asked. Samuel. Will said, his voice thick with emotion. Who feared my father, Samuel John Garrett, for both the men who shaped us. Meg smiled through her tears. Perfect. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world. Hayes finished his work, washing his hands and packing away his instruments. The bleeding is controlled, but Mrs. Garrett needs absolute rest for at least 2 weeks. No getting up except to use the chamber pot. No lifting, no work of any kind. I will make sure she follows orders, Will promised. Outside the bedroom, Nell and Thomas waited anxiously. When Will emerged carrying the baby, both of them crowded close. Meet your nephew, Will said to Thomas. And your little brother? To Nell. Thomas held Samuel with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face. He is perfect, Uncle Will, absolutely perfect. Nell stroked the baby's soft head. Can I help take care of him? We will all take care of him, Will said. That is what family does. The next weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings and the particular exhaustion of new parents. But through it all, Will felt a joy he had thought lost forever. This tiny person, half him and half Meg, represented everything good that could come from choosing hope over despair. Meg recovered slowly but steadily. The bleeding stopped. Her strength returned, and she took to motherhood with the same competence she brought to everything else. On a crisp November morning, they stood in the town square for the harvest festival. Meg held Samuel, now 3 months old, and already showing signs of his father's gray eyes and his mother's determined chin. The new sheriff, Samuel Mason, called for attention from the festival platform. Before we begin today's celebration, I want to recognize the Garretts, he said. A year ago, some of us stood in this square, and watched Margaret Fletcher being sold like livestock. Some of us laughed. Some of us looked away. All of us should be ashamed. He paused, letting that sink in. But Will Garrett saw what we should have seen, a human being deserving of dignity and respect. He stood up when the rest of us stayed silent. And because of his courage and Mrs. Garrett's wisdom, this valley was freed from 5 years of systematic fraud and corruption. They saved us. All of us. The crowd applauded. Some people, including the woman who had mocked Meg at the auction, approached to apologize and asked to see the baby. Meg accepted the apologies with grace, showing Samuel to anyone who wanted to look. Will stood beside her, his arm around her waist, feeling a completeness that had eluded him for so long. As they walked home in the late afternoon sun, their makeshift family around them, Nell said, "Aunt Meg, do you ever think about that day at the auction?" "Sometimes," Meg said, "but not with pain anymore." "Why not?" "Because that was the day I met your uncle, the day my real life began." She looked at Will, her eyes soft. Everything before was just waiting. Will kissed her temple. "Best choice I ever made." Samuel cooed in Meg's arm as if in agreement. Back at the ranch, they sat on the perch as the sun set behind the mountains. The land stretched before them, 400 acres of productive earth, well-watered and well-tended. The barns stood strong, repaired and painted. New fences ran straight and true. The cattle were fat and healthy, ready for the autumn market. But more than the physical improvements, there was something else. A sense of rightness, of purpose, of legacy. "A year ago, I was told I was too old to matter," Meg said softly. "And now," Will asked, "now I know I was exactly the right age to begin again." We both were. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Samuel slept in Meg's arms, peaceful and secure. Thomas and Nell worked in the barn, their voices carrying on the evening air, young and full of hope. Will thought about his father, about Catherine and Daniel, about all the loss that had brought him to this moment. And he thought about the future, about the son who would inherit this land and the values that came with it. "Samuel," he said quietly, though the baby could not understand, "remember this. A man's worth is not measured by his age or his strength or his wealth. It is measured by how he treats those who cannot defend themselves." Meg added, "And a woman's worth is not measured by her youth or her ability to bear children. It is measured by her courage, her wisdom, and her refusal to disappear." They looked at each other and smiled. "And love," Will said, "love has no expiration date." "None at all," Meg agreed. The stars wheeled overhead. The land breathed in the cooling air. And on the porch of Garrett Ranch, a family sat together, bound not only by blood, but by choice, by courage, by the simple decision to stand for something when it would have been easier to stand for nothing. In the years that followed, William Garrett would expand the ranch to 600 acres. He would become one of the most respected ranchers in California, known for fair dealing and honest work. Margaret Garrett would become the first female land rights advocate in Riverside County, helping 23 women secure property ownership and legal protection. She would live to be 82 sharp and strong until the very end. Thomas Fletcher would manage Garrett Ranch for 40 years, proving that redemption was possible for those willing to work for it. He would marry, have children, and become the man his aunt always believed he could be. Eleanor Mason would marry a good man in 1888 and raise 5 children, all of whom would know Meg as grandmother and love her fiercely. Samuel John Garrett would inherit the ranch in 1920 and run it until 1965, always keeping his mother's silver bracelet in his office as a reminder that it was never too late for new beginnings. And Charles Whitmore would serve 5 years in prison before dying penniless and forgotten in 1892, his empire of fraud reduced to dust and bitter memory. But none of that mattered in this moment. In this moment, there was only the porch and the stars and a family who had found each other against impossible odds. In this moment, there was only love and land and the quiet certainty that they had built something worth keeping. The legacy was just beginning.